Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Joygasm, a video game and movie podcast. I'm Russ, and I wish I was a physicist in episode 324 today, August 27th, 2023. We're going to be going right into our topic of the day, which is Oppenheimer movie review. So there's no need whatsoever to skip ahead. So this movie is one that I've been looking forward to all year long. Essentially, when the movie was first released as a teaser trailer, I was completely hooked. I personally am a very, very big fan of Christopher Nolan. I think he has led an exemplary career. When you look at his timeline, when you see all the different films that he's gone through and created, each and every one has its own persona, has its own presence, its own story to tell. So when it came to this, I was like, okay, yeah, I think this is going to be fascinating to see, partly because I am a fan of history, whether it's U.S. history or it's world history. I think it in and of itself is a story to tell, and I love stories. I love listening to stories, hearing stories, digesting said stories. So this film finally came about, and it's interesting because there have been a number of films that are very successful, high profile, Barbie being one, Oppenheimer, of course. There's that meme that's been kind of circulating about over the last month and a half or so. This movie clocks in at around 3 hours long. And what's interesting, first and foremost, is how there really isn't any kind of action going on in this film. Essentially, it is a lot of really, really great actors and performances going on, and it's kind of giving you a sense of what was going on in Oppenheimer's adult life and a lot of the different types of controversies and complex relationships he had. So it was definitely something that I myself was very into. My wife enjoyed it as well when we saw it, but she was definitely checking her clock or her watch at times, thinking about like, okay, we're only an hour in. We have 2 more hours to go. Oh, wow. For someone like myself, I was completely immersed. I really, really enjoyed every aspect of it because Oppenheimer as a person really fascinates me as someone who is incredibly smart at mathematics, at being a physicist, the whole area of science. These are things that I myself am just not knowledgeable about or have been trained in, or really probably I do not have the IQ necessary for something like that. However, it doesn't make me any less fascinated in seeing what went on. What is interesting about this film too is, for me anyway, I had to kind of recalibrate my expectations just because I think I was more caught up in the time period of what all was going on during that time. And when I was watching the film, I was realizing, I would say a few times, that, wow, okay, yeah, this is definitely a focus on the man of J. Oppenheimer. So not a big deal at all, but it was definitely one of those things where I realized how conditioned I was whenever I would hear these types of stories that took place in the 1930s, 1940s, how there was kind of more of like this high level peripheral explanation of things going on instead of like a deep dive into someone like this. The cast is very impressive on this. In fact, I brought up IMDb just to go over the different folks on here. Obviously, we have Cillian Murphy, who plays J. Robert Oppenheimer. Emily Blunt is in this film, who plays Kitty Oppenheimer, who was Oppenheimer's wife. And we have Matt Damon, who played the General Leslie Groves. We have Robert Downey Jr., who plays Louis Strauss. Scott Grimes is in there as part of the council. We have Jason Clarke, who I always find to be a very fascinating presence in films, who plays Roger Robb, one of the lawyers. I mean, it's really interesting. Like Macon Blair is in this. Kenneth Branagh was in this as well. You definitely have a number of heavy hitters that popped up. And for me, like I intentionally made it a point not to actually watch too many of the trailers or watch the one or two trailers I did see too many times because I just wanted to be surprised. And I'm so glad that I did that because I had no idea outside of Cillian Murphy that all these other actors were there. It just didn't, I don't know if they were actually in, I think Emily Blunt was probably in a couple of scenes in the trailer, but for whatever reason, like I was just so focused on Murphy and more of the circumstances that were surrounding that whole area, or I should say time period. It is such a treat though, to be able to see these folks on screen and to see them go through these different types of performances. Oppenheimer, as Christopher Nolan tells his story, is a very complex person. And I would say to a certain degree, even complicated in certain ways, but I was also fascinated with how the story was told. And so certain details, like for instance, him being involved in Berkeley and being associated with like the Communist Party, like that blew my mind. I was not aware of that detail. That kind of like skipped out back when I was in high school taking like U.S. history and that sort of thing. So it was fascinating to see how he was at Berkeley in the Bay Area of California and seeing the kind of the folks who he was hanging around with. He had a girlfriend who was part of the Communist Party, and the mindset of how he had quite a kind of an open-mindedness when it came to capitalism and communism and some of the values that each one shares, and how there was definitely, he didn't sway, at least according to the film, strongly one way or the other. But it was fascinating for me personally to understand, wow, like we have a person who was the father of the atomic bomb who actually had some of those ties, some of those associations at the very least. And so that kind of puts into perspective some of the internal struggles, I think, or concerns at least, that were going on within the United States during that time, because we had World War II definitely having more of a capitalism versus like a fascism, communism type of mindset. And so that was just absolutely crazy to see. Also, too, I thought it was interesting how Oppenheimer was a bit of a womanizer, how that was kind of one of his vices. And the film itself seemed to display, I would say, 3 different women that were in his life. I don't know if those were the only ones or not. But again, like those are the types of details that I myself was not actually prepared for, because I was kind of more of this mindset of wanting to see strictly kind of like we're in World War II and this is all the stuff that's going on and happening. But again, it is fascinating when you have like a focus on a person and you give this very honest, raw depiction of this person in all senses, like both the things that they excelled at and were remembered for, but also some of these other character flaws. You know, the other point that was repeated throughout the film was the relationship that Oppenheimer had with Louis Strauss, who was played by Robert Downey Jr. Now, this was one of the big treats, because I did not know that Robert Downey Jr. was in this film. And apparently there was a lot of, well, not a lot, but like essentially the 2 men got along for the most part. And then there came a point where Oppenheimer was being asked questions at some kind of public hearing or whatever it was. And I think he made a joke at Lewis's expense, and Lewis got butthurt as a result of that and just kind of held a grudge, to the point where he really wanted to embarrass, or maybe go farther than embarrass, but really damage the reputation of Oppenheimer, as well as do irrevocable harm. Ha! Got that word out correctly. To his career. And so that was very interesting to see. And Christopher Nolan had he tends to place a lot of emphasis on how to be cinematically thoughtful with some of the visuals that help to reinforce certain aspects of the film. In this instance, we were jumping back and forth between color and black and white. And in the theater, I was trying to make sense of this because I know watching like Memento, for instance, which was like the first film that put Christopher Nolan really like on the map in Hollywood. In that film, he was going back and forth between the beginning of the story and the end of the story. And by the time you get to the end of the movie, you're kind of meeting in the middle, which was a very original take on storytelling and that sort of thing. In this film, it was interesting because a lot of the past essentially was in color, and then kind of more of the present day within the film was in black and white. I did a little looking online after seeing the movie, and apparently Christopher Nolan was talking about how that was incorporated into the film because they wanted to give more emphasis on whose perspective it was that you were looking at. And so because you have these two men that were predominantly featured throughout the entire movie, whenever you saw it from Oppenheimer's point of view, that's when the movie was in color. Whenever you would see it from Louis Strauss' point of view, then the scenes were in black and white. I didn't necessarily pick up on that my first time watching the movie, but I did make the distinction of, okay, there clearly is an intentional mechanism as to like why we're kind of oscillating back and forth between the two. And so now that I've read that, I was like, oh, okay, I can appreciate that. I would even venture out my own kind of interpretation of that and be able to perhaps have a correlation to each man's personality and character traits. You know, if you were to look at Oppenheimer, he was this person who was, despite being a scientist, very open-minded, very curious. He was also regimented in terms of whenever he's trying to come up with a solution to some sort of physicist-oriented equation or whatever that may be. But his whole outlook on life and his desire to want to learn, be able to learn other languages, be able to learn different types of theorems and learn from different types of professors from both the United States as well as in Europe. You know, I think that paints more of a colorful picture of that versus someone who, like Louis Strauss, who was definitely more of a climbing the ladder type of personality, someone who was very involved with politics, enjoyed the power, saw things perhaps more in a black and white fashion than Oppenheimer did. Again, that's just my personal interpretation of something like that, but I like to kind of share that regardless, even if that was not the intent of Christopher Nolan. I was also fascinated about learning how Oppenheimer, I mentioned this just briefly a moment ago, and I want to kind of go into this a little bit further. In his younger years, because of his curiosity, he was constantly in this state of learning, and he was learning from both American professors, but then also made a distinction about how a lot of the knowledge as it applies to having a career as a physicist was in Europe. And so he would go over there and find a place to live and was learning from these different folks, one of which was a German physicist. And I love, like, one of my favorite scenes was how you had this American who was in the audience and was talking to the person sitting next to him who was German. And he was saying, oh, don't worry, you know, I'll be able to help you translate. 'Cause I speak a little German, and, you know, this guy's from America. He's probably, you know, no problem. Totally assuming he's going to speak English. And then as Oppenheimer begins to lecture to this class in Germany, he starts speaking German. And it was like this total like reversal. And I thought it was so cool because obviously we got to see how like this guy ate a little humble pie, and how like now he's asking the German gentleman next to him, like, hey, can you tell me what he's saying? But at the same time too, it really helped to communicate how Oppenheimer really was this intellectually bright person, how it wasn't just, oh, I'm a scientist, but also he really dove into things like linguistics, how like, there was a moment where the girlfriend was looking at like some of his books and how there was like a book that she pulled out, and I can't remember what the language was, but it was some kind of language that you have to learn how to, it's not some sort of common language. And so he was saying how he was still in the process of learning it, but he could still read it and speak to it, that sort of thing. That's something that for me, I really responded to, just simply because that's not something that I have personally made it a point to do. Like when I was in high school, for example, I would take Spanish classes, but the thing is that the Spanish was very challenging for someone like myself. I have been able to like garner a very basic understanding of the Spanish language. And so like I can say very simplistic things, but I cannot speak it fluently, versus someone like him where he's learning multiple languages, and not only that, but is able to both read it and speak it. I just thought that was absolutely terrific. Another type of foreshadowing in this film that I felt was compelling was the German physicist who he meets and he shakes hands with, and it's obvious that he admires him and how there's like kind of a mutual admiration of sorts. We learn later on how that individual from Germany ends up having to work for Hitler and is in the process of making their own atomic bomb. And it just got me thinking about how often those types of things occur in life. Not limited to the atomic bomb race, but just in general. Like when I think of the types of circles that we all interact in, that we're a part of, that sort of thing, we end up meeting various individuals that have common interests. And as a result, it's kind of like, I don't know, like if you can think of how I don't know, like some sort of diagram where like, here's you in the center and then there's like a circle around you. And this is like your sphere of influence, right? And you have different people who are maybe come into your sphere of influence and come out of it. But whatever your passions are, whatever your interests are, what kind of career you have, that sort of thing, you will find that you will either attract certain people based off those common interests, or maybe you run into them, or perhaps like there's some kind of presentation. And so there's always like this mutual respect and mutual curiosity about those other folks who share those common interests. It could even be the same thing as like if you go onto social media and you join like say a Facebook group, and whatever that common interest is, you will then inevitably learn from different folks and meet different folks that otherwise, if you did not share that common interest, you would never know exist. And I think that's no different from this movie. And I thought it was so haunting how, as things were going on, as there was this realization that, hey, like this theorem has been proven out, because even before there was the race to the atomic bomb, even the theorem, like how to prove out, like how would this work, was also a race into itself. And watching these incredibly smart people just come together and debate over whether or not, certain theorems work, and how each scientist kind of had like their own approach to like proving out a theorem, and how they had to like compare notes and all that. I just loved it. I thought it was such a neat example of having those like impromptu workshops. And especially when it comes to something like that, where nothing's been proven out yet, everything is theory, and how this is just such a textbook example of watching as these men were constantly churning stuff out and coming up with what they felt like was a very plausible theory or solution to something that they can make into a tangible reality. And then watching that process take place where they proved it out into this physical form. I don't know. I think that is also supremely fascinating in a movie like this. Pausing on that and actually going back a bit to the relationship that Oppenheimer had with Louis Strauss, it's interesting how there is this this very weird relationship between science and government, and how the government realizes that in order to prosper and get ahead, they need science. But science is something that is based around this idea of curiosity and wanting to come across different types of discoveries and stuff for the betterment of mankind. And so this movie totally does the same kind of thing, where like they really show how, like, once the government starts, putting all these scientists together, paying for everything, they move out to New Mexico for the entire project, the Manhattan Project, and how regimented the government is and how the military is, despite the fact that, like, when you put those types of folks with scientists, there is a butting of heads that takes place. And so that was an interesting observation too, to watch throughout the movie, how stifling it was at times, where the military is just, super duper regimented. They're very strict. They like to maintain control over everything. And how you had these instances of scientists that were just getting totally burned out or feeling stifled or they don't appreciate, like, not having this kind of sense of freedom. And honestly, that's not limited to scientists at all. Like, in my industry as a creative, that is one of the types of reoccurring types of check-ins, if you will, where you have your supervisors, or say people who are in like project management, who are very much, they're all about the schedule. They need everything and everyone to be organized. And there is definitely a necessity for that. There's a value placed on that, because a lot of creatives are just, they tend to kind of go off into left field. And oftentimes it's a lot like herding cats, if you will. So it's necessary in order for everyone to stay on task and to, kind of work your way down this roadmap that you've scoped out. But at the same time, you don't want to micromanage these creatives, because the creatives will then not feel like they can actually do their best work. So I personally was identifying to a certain extent in those instances where those scientists were just like, I've had it, I quit, I'm taking off, and how Oppenheimer was having to like, no, don't leave, like, here, just take a break, and how he had to talk to Matt Damon's character of the general and saying, like, you can't treat them this way. They're not soldiers, they're scientists. There is a certain type of decorum or behavior that you have to respect. And so there was kind of that tug of war. So overall, the movie itself had quite a number of different interesting outcomes. With Louis Strauss, he was definitely a political person. He was someone who was very much into all that. And it was a little heart-wrenching to see how someone like Oppenheimer, who was the kind of the face, if you will, of this incredible, terrifying invention, but how, like, in his mind, he was thinking about how this type of science goes beyond just making a bomb. How, like, his mind was just thinking about the idea of space and things that, like, I don't know, like, I couldn't hope at this point in time in my life to be able to explain, but I love the idea of where his mind was at with, like, being able to extrapolate and go beyond that. And you see, like, how there's just this ugly side when politics gets involved, or if you have people who had this vendetta against you, who acts in a very vindictive way. And it's just a bummer, because it makes me wonder, what else could have been discovered if all of this didn't take place. I also love too how we got to see Albert Einstein, how Einstein was alive during that time, and seeing the different types of personal relationships that Oppenheimer had with all of these brilliant scientists and whatnot. I thought it was really, really neat. Now, a few things I wanted to also mention, one of which is there's a scene when he's a student and he takes a syringe and it looks like it was like cyanide or something of that nature, some kind of poison. And he put it in the apple of his professor. I saw a story online where the grandson, I believe, of Oppenheimer was objecting to that, saying how like that was never proven out, how like due to certain types of like kind of accounts and reports and stuff, how it was kind of murky in that. So I don't know where Christopher Nolan got that information and what, like why he decided to add that in there or not. I'm not exactly sure, but it was interesting to look at that and think about that. Also, for one, I was surprised that they didn't have the moment where they were putting the bomb together, like the prototype. And there was that one very big moment where something goes wrong, like they were putting it together and then the radiation was leaked. And there was a scientist that actually draped himself over the exposed area and sacrificed himself in order for the rest of the scientists to get out of the room. I was very surprised, and I don't know if Oppenheimer was actually in that room at that time or not, but I mean, I was surprised that they didn't at least showcase something like that. Like maybe Oppenheimer was in his office or something and someone bursts in and says how like so-and-so has been exposed to radiation. And just, I think adding that scene into the film would have actually added even more gravity to the situation of like how dangerous this stuff is and how they actually lost someone as a result, because that story has always stuck out to me. So if I was Christopher Nolan, I would have added that in somewhere, somehow. And honestly, I understand too how there are just so many different elements of a person like Oppenheimer where like, you're already at 3 hours. It's like, how are you going to be able to cram as much goodness as you possibly can? And so perhaps details like the one I just mentioned is more for like the History Channel or whatever. So anyway, this movie, as far as I'm concerned, I think I would give this film 4 out of 5 stars. I think it is just a mesmerizing journey through the life of Oppenheimer. Definitely am informed over multiple aspects of his life that I had no idea about. And it's saying something when you're watching a film that really doesn't have any kind of action to it whatsoever. You're learning about these different people throughout his life. And so it's all about the performance, and all of the performances were absolutely spot on. Anyway, that wraps it up for this particular week. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you enjoyed this episode, I invite you to check out patreon.com/Joygasm, where you can enjoy exclusive perks and early access to the show. Not to mention, it continues to financially help me do the podcast. Also, you can click on that subscribe button as well as that like button, if you so wish. And if you would like, you could also go on social media. We're on just about all of them. Just do a search for Joygasm TV, spelled Joygasm TV, and join the social media aspect of the Joygasm family. Last but not least, do a search for Joygasm TV on Twitch to see us stream our gaming adventures live every Wednesday night at 9:30 p.m. Central Time. I look forward to hanging out with you all again next week when we take a look at Gamescom 2023. We'll see you then.